Okay, why does God have Hosea marry Gomer, a prostitute? The Minor Prophets is a collection of books in the Old Testament which give insight into who God is, how he works, and the history of Israel and Judah. They are just as important to Scripture as the major prophets, but their texts are not as long. One of these minor prophets to Israel, most likely near Samaria in the north, was Hosea, whose ministry was before the exile to Babylon. This book prophesies the results of the Israelites returning to other gods, the separation of their nation from the one true God, the subsequent disastrous results, and the eventual reconciliation. Moreover, God used Hosea's own life as a symbol for this relationship through the prophet's marriage to Gomer, who would be unfaithful to him. Why would God want Hosea to marry Gomer? What is the greater plan? Hosea's life and ministry served not only as prophecy for Israel at that time, but as a reminder today about the consequences of choice, the power of forgiveness, and the importance of virtue. What happened in the book of Hosea? The book of Hosea can be broken up into two thematic sections. There's the story of Hosea, Gomer, and their children, and there's the story of God and Israel. Both are stories of covenant relationships which get violated and then restored. God made a covenant relationship with Israel, promising to bless, and protect them if they follow him, worshiping only the one true God. Marriage is instituted to be a lifelong promise between a man and a woman to be faithful and to help one another. Under the Lord's guidance, Hosea married Gomer, a woman who he knew would commit adultery. The marriage would serve as a symbol for the relationship between God and his people. After King David's death, his son Solomon married hundreds of women from cultures all over the region who worship many false gods. Theologians generally pinpoint this event as the reason that polytheism became more widely practiced in Israel. Eventually, Judah and Israel separated, becoming two separate kingdoms which had their own prophets. Hosea lived in the northern kingdom, and God chose him to live a life which illustrated the relationship between Israel and himself. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take yourself a wife of whoredom and children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom, forsaking the Lord." Hosea chapter 1, verse 2. By setting this example, God wanted Israel to understand the extent of their sins. Gomer gave birth to 3 children whose names reflected the state of the region. When they were born, their names were sad, symbolizing the turning away of the nation and the tragedy that would befall the people. The first son's name was Jezreel, because God said, "I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day, I will break I'll break the bowl of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." Hosea chapter 1, verses 4 to 5. Their daughter was named La Ruhuma, or no mercy, because God would show no mercy. Third child's name was Not My People, Lo Emi. It was common among the families in the Bible for their children to bear names of significance. One of the most significant examples was before the flood. Enoch named his son Methuselah, which theologians agree translates roughly to "when he dies, it shall come," or "upon his death, it comes." The it is the great flood. Likewise, Hosea's children received their names in this tradition. Hosea and Gomer, separation and reconciliation. Gomer does leave Hosea and commit adultery, but eventually her husband retrieves her, taking her back into his home and forgiving her. This reconciliation foretold the future return to God the nation of Israel would make and his forgiveness. Majority of the 14 chapters deal with the specific prophecies about this separation from God and his eventual reconciliation. And beyond the sequence of events, little is known about Hosea's life, wife, and children. It does not discuss how he felt, only that he obeyed. Hosea was not the only prophet whose life reflected the state of relationship between God and his people. Ezekiel, a prophet in Judah, was called by God to act out his life in such a way that it foretold the siege of Jerusalem in 587 BC. "And lie on your left side, and place the punishment of the house of Israel upon it. For the number of days that you lie in it, you shall bear their punishment. For I assign you to a number of days, 390 days, equal to the number of years of their punishment. So long shall you bear the punishment of the house of Israel. And when you have completed these, you shall lie in a second time on the other side, bear the punishment of the house of Judah. 40 days I assign you, a day for each year. You shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem, with your arm bared, and you shall prophesy against the city. And behold, I shall place cords upon you, so that you cannot return from one side to another till you have completed the days of your siege. Ezekiel chapter 4, verses 4 to 8. God sometimes called this on his prophets to symbolically and sacrificially in order to communicate to the people. Much like Christians today are called to live by faith, which sometimes includes taking risks that do not make sense, while few Christians are called to take a spouse or live in the streets. To symbolically communicate things today both require trust and obedience. Why did God let bad things happen to Hosea, a good man? One of the biggest questions that arises from the life of Hosea is why God would orchestrate his obedience prophet's life in such a manner that Hosea would suffer so much. He married Gomer knowing that she would become an adulteress, suffer the humiliation of her having multiple affairs, and gave his children sad names because of this marriage. Hosea was a prophet, obedient to his Lord, but still he suffered. It is a picture of a good man who has many bad things happen to him. Despite the hardship through Hosea's life, God works out the redemption of Gomer through her husband's forgiveness. She is welcomed back into her husband's home, much like how the father of the prodigal son forgave the young man and brought him back into the home. The Lord used these hardships to teach Israel and all future generations about the long-suffering patience of God, who waits for the sinful to come to him. During the prophetic communications in this book, God says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Hosea chapter 11, verses 1 to 2. Over and over, the Lord emphasized his love for his people, everything he did for them, and the breakaway of seeing them choosing false idols over him. He redeemed them anyway after a period of chastisement and exile. Correcting through chastisements at times of difficulty are some of the ways God shows his love. He did not want his children to behave badly, to wallow unchanging in spiritual immaturity and sin. Instead, he wants them to grow and become righteous. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. Though the people of Israel and Hosea went through difficult times, God used the hardship. Now, also you can see that God also uses this book when it comes to talking about divorce and remarriage. The fact that no matter how bad the spouse may act, okay, the church may be adulterous, he still calls them to be repentant and still goes after them and still be faithful to them, even though they're not faithful to him. And if you don't know, in the Bible, the Bible forbids divorce and remarriage. Marriage is until death do you part. If you marry while your first spouse is still alive, you're committing adultery. And this is a perfect example of God calling the one who did not cheat to still stay faithful to the spouse that did cheat, or the fact that your spouse, maybe you have sinned in that area. God would still want you to stay faithful, even if the spouse does not want you back. This is just how it is. God could have called us to a life of holiness, and it's not easy. A lot of the times it's not easy, but if you're willing to trust him, he'll help you. All right. This is all I got to say about it. You take care and be blessed. Like, share, comment, and subscribe if you liked the video.